basic introduction on classes. So have you guys learned about classes in your computer science class yet? And as usual, you can just type in the chat or you can speak out loud. Not yet, yes. Have you talked about objects at all, Lindsay? Yes? Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, we're just going to do a very basic introduction to classes today. So for some of you, hopefully this will be a good refresher. Lindsay, if something does not make sense, please let me know. All right. So today we are going to talk about classes. So a class is basically a cookie cutter that produces an object. So this is the definition that our Rise Up for CS textbook gives us, but I also like to think of a class in my own head as sort of like a blueprint. It's giving you kind of like the recipe or the design. There are actually a lot of analogies that you could use for it, but it's basically the layout of what you want a certain object to look like. And so all objects created from the same class are going to have all of the same fields and methods. It's just that the values of those fields are going to be different for each one. And so you can think of the field of an object as an attribute, so kind of like a noun or an adjective. And then you can think of the method of an object as verbs or actions. And so what classes do is they basically just lay out all of the different types of attributes that an object could possibly have and all the different kinds of possible actions that an object could possibly do. Does that basic definition make sense? And if you haven't seen a class before, it will probably get clearer when I show you an example. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, great. And I think it will also become a little bit clearer once we look at some actual code. Okay, so one specific part of a class that it's important to talk about is a constructor. And so a constructor is the method that you use to initialize the fields of an object when it is created. So this bottom example is what a constructor would look like if we had a class called person. And so basically a constructor, how you know it's a constructor is it always has the same name as the class you are creating it for. And there's never going to be a return type for a constructor because all it is doing is creating an object of that class. And so usually what you do inside of a constructor is you set some initial variables that you want to use for that specific object. And so that will also probably make more sense when we look at the code. But the important thing to remember is that if you have a class, it is the blueprint, and you create the actual objects that you're making from that blueprint through the constructor. So the constructor is what initializes your object. Does that definition make sense to you guys? Okay, cool. And so every class has to have a constructor because obviously you are always going to want to be creating objects from your classes. If you weren't creating objects, there wouldn't really be a purpose of having a class. And even if you don't see a specific constructor within a class, that is because every object in Java has kind of a just like a pre-made constructor. And so we're going to talk about this more in another webinar when we talk about polymorphism and subclasses. But basically all that you guys should know for now is that every single class is always going to have a constructor because you are always going to need to create objects from that class. So now let's look at some code. Okay. All right, so to show you guys what a class is, I just created a basic class called person. So this class is something that you could use maybe if you were creating a program where you needed to create a person object. And so obviously a person has many different attributes. For this class specifically, I decided that the things we would want to know about a person are their name, their email, and their phone number. And so then if you look down here, we have all of the different kind of verbs or methods that describe the actions of what this person can do. And so for a person, we are always going to want to have a method to get and set these different attributes. And so this has to do with, if you guys have talked about encapsulation and information hiding. If you haven't talked about that yet in class, don't worry too much about it. But basically, a best practice in Java is that instead of just accessing these fields directly when you have a class, you want to create something called getters and setters to access the fields of a class. And so a setter is just a method that sets the specific field of a class to be a certain value, and a getter is a method that you call in order to retrieve that value. So for example, in our person class, we want to have getters and setters for each of our 3 attributes. So if we just look at the first one for name, here we have a method called getName. And so what this method does is when you call it, it's just going to return the name attribute of an object. And actually, I'm just going to remove this really fast. So we don't need that. Okay, sorry about that. So here you can see we have our getName method, and all that it's doing is it's returning the name attribute of this specific object. And then we have the same thing for email and the same thing for phone number. And then down here we have all of our setter methods. So what these are going to do is instead of getting our attributes, here the methods are going to set them. And so all of these methods are going to be void because we don't want to actually return anything from them. Instead, what we want to do is take in a parameter of what the new value is going to be that we are setting each attribute to. And then in the body of the method, we are setting it to be that. So for setName, we are setting our name attribute up here equal to whatever our program user passes in as the new name. So do getters and setters sort of make sense to you guys? They do exactly what their names say. They just get attributes and set attributes. Okay, great. So now let's talk about the constructor. So here is our constructor, which, like I said earlier, this is the method that we are going to use to initialize a person object from this class. And so when you create a constructor, you can pick and choose which fields of the object you want to initialize. So in this one, the only thing that we're initializing here is name. So you can see that for this constructor, we are going to pass in a parameter called the name, and then we are going to set name equal to that. So basically what this means is every time we create a new person object, it is automatically going to have its name initialized. However, since we don't initialize email and phone, these are going to be null at first until a user actually decides to call our set methods and set those attributes equal to something. So if you wanted to, you could change this constructor so that the user would have to pass in an email and a phone number. So then email and phone number. But that isn't completely necessary. You get to pick and choose what you want the object to have stored in the first place. Does that make sense so far? Okay, great. So I guess the next thing that we should talk about really quickly is public versus private. Or actually, trying to think if we should talk about that today or not. Maybe we will save that for another webinar actually. But since I did have these declared as private, and so, also I just want to say, so this person class I actually also got from the ebook. So if you want to go back and look at that, all of this is in the ebook if you want to try experimenting with this yourself. But so in the ebook, they have these fields declared as private instead of public. And just basically all that that means is that this variable is only going to be able to be used inside the scope of this class. So if you try to call, or if you try to access name, email, or phone number anywhere outside of this class, it wouldn't work. That wouldn't be visible to another part of the program. And that's sort of why we have getters and setters, because these are public. And so you can access them outside of this specific class. So these methods are what the user can use in order to get access to these fields. But we are going to talk more about also private versus public another day. That was just like a little basic overview for you guys. So now if we go down, I also put in a main method so we could see what actually using a class and creating objects looks like. So when you declare an object, which I think you guys all said you talked about in class already, when you first declare an object, you're going to have the type of that object. So here we are creating a person called P1, and then you set it equal to a new object. And so this is where classes come in, because you can see, you guys are probably used to, for those of you who have not seen classes yet in your computer science classes, when you declare an object to be equal to a person or whatever this first variable is, a string, a cat, a dog, whatever it is, this is actually just from this class. So when we said P1 equal to be a person, that is saying to go into the person class and then instantiate a new object using this constructor. So that is why whenever you initialize a new object, you set it equal to just whatever that object is called, and then you have your parentheses and then maybe a parameter inside, because that is just your constructor. So for our person class, we created a constructor where you had to know what the name was, because we're passing in our name here. So that is why for this person, we are going to pass in Santa. And then if we were to run this program, just looking at the first line where we print out this first person, up here we have, oh, have you guys talked about toString yet in class or no? Okay, so for those of you who have not talked about toString yet, basically toString is just a method that it takes an object and it decides what information to print out if you just put that object into a print statement. So for example, if we didn't have this toString method, what would default be printed out if we said system.out.println p1 is the address that that object is pointing to. But obviously to a person who is using this program, that information is probably not going to be very useful to them. So instead you can create your own toString method where you tell it what kind of information you want to print out. So for the person class, we have a toString method that instead of printing out the address of the object, we're going to print out its name plus its email plus its phone number. And we can go into depth more on toString in another webinar. But basically, just all you need to know for right now is that it's telling us what we want the person class to print out if we just put a person object in a print line statement. So like I said, we just want to print the name, the email, and the phone number. So in this first line here, that is what we are doing. And so name prints out Santa because that is what we declared it to be when we first initialized our person object here. We passed in Santa, and so now the Santa object has that as its name. But we still haven't initialized an email or a phone number for Santa, and so those values are going to be null. So then we have a second person object that we are creating, P2. We pass in Jean as the name, and then here you can see we are using our setter methods to set Jean's email and to set Jean's phone number. So now when we print out Jean, we go to the toString method, and it's going to first print her name, then it's going to print her email, and then it's going to print her phone number. And I'm also going to delete this from that because we don't need to talk about that right now. So then that's going to just print out Jean at gmail.com, and then her phone number. What does this in the front mean? We're not going to talk about this right now. That was my mistake. I meant to take that out, and I did not. But when we talk a little bit more in depth on objects and classes later, we can talk about what this means. But you guys don't need to worry about that for right now. So does this all make sense? Okay, so if you guys don't have any other questions right now, we are going to create our own class together. So now we are going to try to create a class if we wanted to create some dog objects. And so if we're creating our dog class, the first thing we need to know are what fields we want our dog class to have. So if you were to think about a dog object, what kind of attributes do you think that you should know about a dog? Anyone have any ideas? Name, good. So we should probably have string name, breed, color. Okay, great. And then age, so we can just make that an integer. So, all right, great. So now we need to create the constructor for our dog class. So does someone want to type me out in the chat what they think that our constructor should be if we want to initialize all of these values? And so remember, for our person class, it's just public, and then the name of our class, and then what values we wanted to pass in to initialize our fields. Yes, yeah. All right, great job, Amanda. So I'm going to copy that. But just so it's not confusing when we go into the body method and we set our parameters equal to our instance variables, I'm going to just make this n, b, c, and n. When we actually set them equal to each other, it's not confusing that we have name is equal to name. So we'll have name equal to n, breed equal to b, color will be set equal to color C, and we will have age set equal to A. All right, great. So now we have our initial constructor, and we also have what variables we want each dog object to have. So the next thing that we need to come up with is what we want our dog objects to actually do. So if you were thinking about a dog, what kind of actions would you want your dog to be able to complete? All right, great. So bark, that's a good one. So we could have public, bark probably wouldn't return anything. Public void bark. What kind of sound do you want our dog to make? Should just say woof. Roll over, fetch. All right, let's also do one for roll over. So maybe you could have it say, you could have the dog's name. So name plus okay, so then the next thing that we need are our getters and our setters to get and set these values if we want them to be different. So could you guys in the chat write out for me, and I'll show you guys our getters and our setters one more time for the person class. So if we wanted to get name, all we're doing is returning that name field. And for our setters, all that we're doing is passing in a name parameter and setting the name equal to that parameter. So could you guys tell me what the getter and the setter would be for breed? All right, good job, Alexis. So that's our setter. Getter, sorry. And then we're going to do the same thing for breed, color, and age, except age will return integer. Color, returning breed, and then, oh, sorry about that. And then what about for our setters? All right, good job, Rita. So I'll copy that in. Set age, breed, set color, and then here, each. Why is this giving me an error? Oh. All right, great. So this looks like a pretty good dog class. So does everything that we've written out so far make sense to everyone? Okay, great. So now let's say that we wanted to create a main method. And we want to create a and you can name it whatever you want. The breed can be whatever you guys want to be, but let's have it be brown. And let's have its age, let's say the dog is 5. So could you guys type out for me if we wanted to create a new dog object from this class and we wanted those two things to be true, what that would look like? All right, good job, Amanda. So Amanda created a dog whose reference she named Doggy, and we're going to have its name be Joe. Joe is going to be a lab, and like I said, he's going to be a brown dog, and he's going to be 5. Does that answer make sense to you guys? So, Alexis, for your answer, so when you say dog P1 equals new dog brown, remember that our constructor has 4 parameters, and so you need to have a value for all 4 of these things when you create a new dog object. And so even though I just told you guys that the dog should be brown and it should be aged 5, you still need to have in its constructor a name and a breed. Does that make sense? Because if I just typed in, let's say I said dog, and then you just had brown, we're going to get an error because Java doesn't see a constructor that matches just having 1 argument. Instead, it's going to tell us that we should add more arguments to match what we wrote up here. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Trying to think if we should talk about anything else or if that's good. Oh, so one other thing is that we could also, let's say that whenever you create a dog object, you want its age to start at 0. If you're creating a dog, it doesn't have an age yet. So then what you could do is instead of passing in its age, if you just always wanted the dog's age to start at 0, you can just set that yourself. So instead of having an age parameter that the user has to create, instead you can automatically say that you want the dog's age to start at 0. So then if we were to go in and say system.out. And then we did doggy.age. Then we run this. That's going to print out 0 because whenever we create a new dog object, we are now initializing age to be 0. Does that make sense? All right, great. So now I'm going to pass it off to Jack, who's going to take you guys through some practice questions.
Hi, everyone. So we have a few practice questions for you tonight. Some things to keep a note once you open it up. There'll be a section that asks you to create a class of your own. For that class, I know Hannah went into a lot of detail. We're really just looking for focus first on the instance variables and the constructors, and then if you have enough time, work on the getters and the setters. However, we just want to make sure you understand like the basics of this lecture, so do as much as you can, but maybe it would be helpful to start with the other questions first and save that one for last. We're going to try to have you all wrap up by 8:45, maybe closer to 8:50. So try to get your answers in by 8:45, and if you need more time, then we can reevaluate for there. Okay, and if you have any other questions, feel free to write them in the side chat window. If you haven't already, try to wrap up within the next minute or so. Okay, it looks like everyone finished up, so I'm going to share my screen with you so that we can start going over the questions. So, okay, here. Let me do this. Okay, cool. So, ignore this error message on my computer. It's having some issues. But yeah, the first question asked, what was the purpose of a constructor? And you guys all did a really nice job with this one. And that constructors are meant to initialize the field of the object. So for example, going back to Hannah's example, in the dog class, we were able to initialize the name, the breed, the age of the dog, all by using constructors. And yeah, that's really their whole purpose. However, going over to the next question, I'm going to skip to the true or false question because this was also about constructors, but this one you guys seem to get tripped up on. All classes do not need to they do have to have a constructor. However, what's interesting is that Java has the built-in default constructor. So even if you don't write one yourself, there is always the default constructor, which has no parameters, that's initializing the values to their default values in the background. And that's why when Hannah showed you that example, there was no error message that came up. So yeah, but if all classes have an instructor, this is in fact true. And this could be something you see on the AP test. So just because you don't see a constructor doesn't mean it's not there. Next, we're going to go into creating the long one. And so this asks us to create a class for a car dealership that could store information about the cars for sale. And we needed the number of doors, whether the car had air conditioning, and the average number of miles per gallon. So let me open up Java. And you guys did a very nice job with your constructor. So again, but the first thing we'll do is we'll create some instance variables. I'm just going to go ahead and make these private, for example. So private doors or private integer doors, and that can represent the number of doors we have. We can have private air conditioning. We can have that be a Boolean air conditioning, representing whether or not, let's do AC for short, whether or not our car has air conditioning or not, and the average number of miles per gallon. Some of you I noticed use int, but we're going to use double here because it is an average, so it could be a decimal. If you said integer on the AP exam, like you would still get partial credit, but whenever they say average, remember we're going to be looking for a double there. So miles per gallon, MPG. Yeah, some of you, all of you seem to have done a nice job with the constructor, but remember you will also need these variables with it. And it doesn't really matter for our sake whether or not they're private or public. The next thing we're going to do is make the constructor itself. So public car, and a lot of you did the order into, let's do D for doors, Boolean A for AC, and then double gallons for number of gallons we get. Yeah, a lot of you did a nice job remembering to include this. So we can set doors equals to D, AC equal to A, and gallons for MPG equals gallons. So yeah, that's essentially the basics of what we were looking for here. So nice job for those of you who remember to include everything, and then a special pat on the back to those of you who even included your getters and your setters for your other methods. If you did include those, they looks like all correct to me. You guys did a really nice job. And then the final thing we asked you to do in this set of practice questions was to create an instance of. So I'm going to create a main real fast, like static void. So in our main, if we wanted to make an instance of this car, you guys seem to have a good understanding of that. So let's just call our car, we can call our car equals new car. And I think it had 4 doors. It had AC and had 30 miles per gallon. So we can do true. And yeah, that would be exactly how you did that. And again, you all seem to have a really good, clear understanding. One thing I did notice is a few of you forgot the semicolon. And that is one thing that the AP exam graders are really picky about. They, after looking over their scoring rubric, they can take up to 1 point per missing semicolon. So be extra careful that you remember to include those when you are writing out your code on the exam itself. So yeah, does anyone have any other questions from the practice questions? Would you like me to go over one? Overall, you guys did a nice job, and if I had one piece of advice, remember, even though you might not see a constructor, that doesn't mean it isn't there, and all classes have constructors. But any other questions? Feel free to keep typing your questions if you have any. Hannah and I will stick around for a bit to answer any more if you want to ask them in a more individualized setting. If not, I've just posted the link to the one-on-one tutoring. This is our last webinar for the year 2017. Webinars will pick up back up in January. However, we still do have some one-on-one tutoring slots open, even though we are taking a break from the webinars as us here at the University of Maryland have finals and winter break. So keep a lookout on the calendar for one-on-one tutoring spots that will be open if you guys need any additional help. So yeah, other than that, that's all we have for tonight. So thank you all who came out, and we hope to see you back in January. See you, Hannah.